for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Good evening, Fade to Black. Bespoke Radio for the masses. Today's Tuesday, January 7th, 2020. How you doing? How you doing? That's right, today's January 7th, which means 7 days into the new year. Only 358 days left. We are live from a bunker. A bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world. All across the United States. Hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the planets. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? How you doing? Crazy night tonight. I get it, but we are all here. We're all here because tonight we have a very special guest. Tonight is the return of Micah Hanks. Yeah. Man, I'm so excited. Micah Hanks is here. Going to be a great conversation. And we'll get to all of that in just a bit. Tomorrow night, William Henry joins us from Nashville. And Thursday night is another Fader night with open lines all night long. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. I fully expected Twitter tonight to be completely engaged and out of control, as it should be, certainly with the breaking news that we had a couple of hours ago, and I will get to all of that. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. The sandbox on Twitter is hashtag F2B. Come and hang out with us. We don't bite. And tonight, just like any other night on the show, we're going to blaze through 2, 3, maybe 4,000 tweets. And we do all of that with hashtag F2B and certainly use TweetDeck and get involved in the conversation. We also have 2 chat rooms open, one over at Spreaker. You can get in over there, or you can also go over to KGRA, the planet, where we have another chat room over there. Okay, email is jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. Questions or comments tonight is hashtag F2BQ, which is Fade to Black Questions. That's F, the number 2, B, and Q. Fade to Black Questions. Okay, all right. Yes. Tonight, it's Micah Hanks. He's a writer, he's a podcaster, he's a history fanatic, he's a science enthusiast, and a philosophy junkie. He's also a tanning enthusiast, too, as well, and a Formula One race car driver. His areas of focus include current events, cultural studies, technology, unexplained phenomena, and ways the future of mankind can be influenced by science and innovation in the coming decades. He has appeared on numerous television and radio programs, including Coast to Coast AM, Caravan to Midnight with John B. Wells, the History Channel's Guts and Bolts, CNN Radio, and, of course, Fade to Black. He's the author of several books, including The Ghost Rockets, Mysticism and the Molecule, The Search for Sentient Intelligence from Other Worlds, The Reynolds Mansion and Invitation to the Past, and UFO Singularity. Micah currently hosts the Micah Hanks program, formerly known as The Grailian Report. We got to get Micah to cut a new drop for us here on Fade to Black. And, of course, the Middle Theory podcast and the 7 Ages Audio Journal podcast. His website is micahhanks.com, and he's got a great blog there, too, as well. I'd like to welcome back to Fade to Black, Micah Hanks. Micah, good evening, my friend. How are you?
Good tidings, and go Beckley Tepe to you.
Go Beckley Tepe. You know, Micah, I refuse to grow up, right? I don't want to be the adult that my parents and grandparents appeared to be. And when I was young, I'm 56 today, but what 56 appeared to be around me, and I refused to grow up. Well, today, 2 hours before showtime, I was forced to be an adult, to face things that adults have to deal with, and that is certainly what is going on in the Middle East. And it's a sobering situation that we find ourselves in as a nation. For you, being a historian and the way that you look at technology in our country and our world, 2 hours ago, we were bracing for this kind of news, and it happened. What do you think is ultimately going to be facing the world tomorrow?
You know, the future is always uncertain, Jimmy. And first, let me thank you. That's kind of you to call me a historian. I'm a dedicated amateur at very best, and I'll keep my historical assessments simple for tonight. But right off the bat, one assessment we might make is that it's perfectly normal for guys like you and, myself to feel like we don't want to grow up. In fact, I think a lot of our politicians in Washington obviously don't want to do that either. But I think that in terms of what we're seeing, the gravity, I'm not going to make, and you're the same way. We talked about this during the air check. It's not about arguing a right or a left perspective at a time like this, because really, I think that circumstances like what we're seeing unfold potentially right now in the Middle East, I hope things do not escalate further beyond this, but we hoped the same thing yesterday, and they sure did, didn't they? So, I think that this is, if nothing else, evidence that we have bigger issues at play than American politics. That obviously plays into it, but we've got to look at things internationally. And, I don't want to make broad sweeping statements, but it is, I think, important for us to remember that we are all one civilization. We are all human beings, and despite the facade of differences imposed by politics or region or culture or any of these things, we've got to remember that we are all flesh and blood human beings, and we share this planet. And we won't have a planet if we start pushing big red buttons and launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at one another, right? So, again, really, I think there's obviously a nuanced conversation that has to be had about what's going on right now. And, hopefully world leaders, policy analysts, foreign policy experts, they're going to have that, and they are having that right now with little doubt. But, sometimes I do think it is. If we really step back and we look at the big picture, it really is as simple as we're all on the same side when it counts, and we should try and act like it. We should try and remember that. Jimmy, you were talking about in your opening segment music and films and things that you and Rita may watch later. And, I've got to make a film reference here as well. You remember the scene where Tom Hanks holds his hand up and he can cover the entire earth with his thumb, right?
Right.
Iconic scene. But again, that's kind of, that's in the same line of thought as what we're talking about here. Once you get far enough back to be able to see the big picture, you realize how small we all are, how fragile this world is, how fragile human lives are, how delicate, this gift of life that we have actually is. And at times like this, I hope that if not collectively, we each as individuals can kind of make that choice to say, look, we are all fundamentally on the same team. We're all earthlings. We're all humans. And in that line of thinking, I guess this is why on the show last night, on the Micah Hanks program, I played that audio soundbite. You mentioned also when we were riffing a little bit, because folks at home, when Jimmy and I talk, both being longtime guitar aficionados, it ain't just talking, it's riffing, baby.
That's right. That's right.
As we were riffing, during the sound check, you'd mentioned Ronald Reagan, and I, share your affinity for Reagan because I remember when the Challenger shuttle exploded. Again, being a history junkie, I love going back and watching these presidential addresses. And one of the things that he said that touched me so much about that was he specifically spoke to the children in the audience. And he said to the children, he said, I'm sure many of you young people watching are wondering why that happened and what it means and why things like this have to happen. And I loved that Reagan had that ability to not just communicate, but he could communicate to children. And he could communicate fundamental truths like that. And that was one of the most touching things that I remember him ever saying. But, of course, another was addressing the United Nations in 1987 and saying, would it take a universal threat? Is that what it would take to make human beings realize that we are indeed all one? And yet he says, I ask you, is there not, and I'm paraphrasing here, this isn't a direct quote, but he says, is there not already an alien threat, an alien presence among us? Because I can imagine nothing more alien than the threat of war. I think we should remember those words right now.
The other part about this, when we think about this at a global level, is that this planet has been dealing with the Middle East since 2001. Right? Mm-hmm. It's now been nearly 20 years. Certainly, we've been dealing with it here in the United States, and our forces are there, but there are forces from around the world that are in that region with the coalition. They've been putting up with this. At one point, do we just throw up our hands and say, enough is enough? We need to just pull this back here. We're tired. When do we reach that?
Well, I'll make this observation. In terms of saying enough is enough, rather than criticizing the current administration, or our current elected officials in any branch of government, something I would really urge people to do, because those criticisms exist, they should be made. But right now, and this is something else you and I talked about, programs like Fade to Black are kind of people's escape from reality. And when stuff really gets dangerous like this, we're forced to have to talk about those not so fun subjects on a very fun program like this, which is why we're doing it. But again, I think that there's a right and a wrong way to do it. And so in an effort to try and approach your question from a nonpartisan perspective, one thing I would urge people to do is, if you really don't want wars, go out there and listen, we're headed into 2020 here. And actually, we're already in it, but this next election cycle, who's saying we don't want foreign wars? Because the problem to me doesn't seem to be, exclusive to one political party or ideology. If memory serves, going back to 2001, like you mentioned, we had a new president at that time, George W. Bush, and he was faced with this tremendous task of, okay, wow, how do we navigate the storm in the aftermath of what had been the greatest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 attacks? And throughout his administration, of course, we're embroiled in conflict in the Middle East. Throughout the next administration under Barack Obama, we have the same thing. I mean, remember that Woodward's book about him during that period of Obama's presidency was entitled Obama's Wars. That trend continues today. I see no better way of expressing that, it shouldn't be a partisan issue. This is an issue that endures irregardless of the party. I think it has a lot to do with really deeper rooted problems in American government and foreign policy and all these kinds of things. If we really don't want to be involved in another 20 years of war, what we need to be thinking about heading into 2020 is, who is saying they don't want war? Go find those people. People also remember that you as human beings, wherever you are in the world, or if you're here in the United States as, voters, you do have a voice. I was kind of shocked, Jimmy, at how many people in the last election just said, well, it was a crap sandwich and a whatever on the other side. I didn't have good options, so I just didn't vote. I just opted out. But opting out really isn't the best option if you really want to see change. But, I also think that a good way to do it is to engage in discussion. And I saw this quote by Margaret Atwood earlier today, that war is what results when dialogue, when conversation, when communication fails. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation right now because, I think that also talking, educating, and informing people on issues that we face as one unified civilization here on the planet, that's an important aspect of all this too. Education is key.
It was just announced 6 minutes ago. A Boeing 737 passenger jet has crashed in Iran shortly after takeoff. This just happened. This is being reported by Bloomberg. 180 passengers and crew on board. The plane was bound for the Ukraine. And this is absolutely last-minute breaking news. And before we even go conspiracy on this, it is a very strange coincidence that a plane crash like this occurs a couple hours after lobbing ballistic missiles into a foreign country. Very strange. Coincidence? Could be. But this is breaking news, and we will get more on this as we get information coming in. And this is the other part. Look, I just read this breaking news, right? 737. This would be big news on any other day, this 737 crashing. But we are now acclimated, Micah, to crazy, disturbing, dark, harsh news on a 24-hour news cycle, right? It's coming in all day long. And I feel that the media and governments and state actors have got us so acclimated to the addiction of getting dark news on our phone all day long, right? It's turned into some kind of opiate, right? Where this dark news feed is constantly coming at you, and it has to affect us not only at an emotional level, but maybe all the way down to our DNA, right? Where it alters our brain chemistry. And here we are with a crazy news day today, and we're going to cap it off with a 737 crashing in Iran. It's pretty nuts, isn't it? How does the world cope with dark news 365 days a year?
Well, that's a complex one. But again, my background in talk radio, I was a producer, on-air producer, occasional host. Also, I was with what is now iHeartMedia. At the time, it was Clear Channel. And I left. I struck out to become an independent guy, right? But I remember back in those days, I was talking with one of our program directors, and he said, in this era of 24-hour news cycles, we can get our fix anytime we need it. And I think you're absolutely right to liken it to an addiction. Many people are. I'm sure that there are studies on this. In fact, I've probably read a few, but I read a lot of studies. And, the not only emotional connection, well, actually, I would say it's not so much an emotional connection. I think it is just this sort of thrill. It's this sort of feedback loop.
Right.
It's a dopamine high,
right,
where you're always looking for the next most thrilling thing. And what is more thrilling? I mean, we all love seeing, puppies and little tiny baby Yodas on The Mandalorian and stuff like that. That's fun, but it's not maybe really thrilling. And I think people, what's really scary is they are not only seeking thrills, but over time, addiction to a 24-hour news cycle seems to be desensitizing us, to the point that you can read about rapes, murders, killings, war, and people just don't even react to it, which is really frightening to me because, at some point we seem to be forgetting in this thrill ride that we are now on how to be human. And I remember talking to the program director I mentioned, and he said when the Challenger shuttle exploded, to bring that up again, it's a great example historically, tragic though it was, he said, we're all sitting at home, whatever's on television's on television, and then there's a very, not sudden bling-bling explosions, loud noise. There's a quiet kind of soft segue. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you breaking news, and now here's Walter Cronkite or whomever was the anchor at that time, and they informed the public of what's just happened. You heard the news when there was significant news to be reported. There wasn't this addiction to a thrill ride, and therefore this kind of, this impetus, I guess, given to networks to find the most juicy and most disturbing news to feed that addiction. They know that they're going to be able to keep people glued to the television or the radio or their smartphones or whatever else if they give them what they're after. And so because of that, what do you see every day in the news? You see a lot of negative news. I mean, that's what sells, but it's a strange kind of a feedback loop, a kind of self-perpetuating issue where people not only are going looking for that, but the media networks know that giving people that is going to keep them glued. What happens when we come unglued, when we no longer need that thrill, or no thrill that they can offer us is good enough? I mean, that's a scary prospect too, because it begins to raise questions about how far humans will go for that weird stimulation. And I don't think fundamentally, evolutionarily speaking, if I want to approach this from an anthropological perspective, our ancestors, Jimmy, sat and they looked at the stars at night. They watched meticulously the movement of stars through the heavens. And as we see at sites like Göbekli Tepe, for instance, there are these celestial alignments represented at almost all of these sacred ceremonial sites from the ancient past, going back, 5,000, 10,000 years, or even earlier, like Göbekli Tepe. But they had to meticulously watch the stars at night. That was the best entertainment that nature could buy at that time. I don't think that humans are programmed fundamentally to be so overstimulated, so hyperstimulated all the time. And I'm really not sure that it's doing us any good. I don't think that there's really as much benefit to it as being informed, citizens by watching the news all the times is touted as being. I think sometimes it's much healthier for us to unplug and to look at news when it's actually important. But unfortunately today, you're right, it's very important news we're seeing. It's very unfortunate news. I hope, and this is the last thing I'll say about the current news for the time being, unless you want to keep talking about it. But I mean, I'm hoping tomorrow we're going to have some better news. I think we've all been holding our breath the last 24, 48 hours or so.
Right. I agree with that. And this is, let me respond actually. I wake up in the morning and, and I check my cell phone for the news. I look at the headline just to make sure that the planet hasn't blown up, right? That's as far as I go. I don't scroll through or read the news because I know what the headlines are, right? Husband arrested for decapitating wife or whatever, right? It's just one bad story after another, just disturbing stuff, and I don't engage in it. But this is what I find strange about that. Do you remember the video series Faces of Death?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, when Faces of Death was out there were rumors about it, right? Hey, man, my friend's got the videotape for Faces of Death Part 2. We're going to go over to his house and watch, and how disturbing it was. And now today, you go back and watch Faces of Death, and it's nearly comedy, right? But that's not the point. The point was back then, you had to go and search for it. You weren't going to get that with Walter Cronkite. You weren't going to get that on the evening news. You weren't going to get it anywhere. Faces of Death was this dark underground enigma that you had to go out and seek and find. Faces of Death, this is how desensitized we are. Faces of Death is 24/7 on any video channel, any news service, any network, any YouTube channel, all over, everywhere, and you can go and watch it. And that, not Faces of Death, real Faces of Death. And that's where we are today. I don't get where we took the turn. And I don't want to sound like my dad. I just don't want to do that. But we did actually have happier times. As crazy as the world was, right? There was always crazy events going on, but we didn't have it in our faces affecting us, right? I truly believe, and I've corrected this in my life, Micah, that the news used to make me physically ill. And I found out about 6 years ago. We went out, and Rita and I, we were somewhere in the country, and we disengaged for like 4 days. No news, no internet. We didn't have a TV or whatever in our hotel room, or we did, but we never turned it on. Totally disengaged. Came back after 4 or 5 days, and I'm walking through the house, and I turn on the TV, and I turn it to CNN, and it's an ISIS beheading video. right there.
Oh,
All right. Mm-hmm. And I physically got ill. And I could feel it, right? I felt my body. I went, that's it. I was fine. That's what's doing it to me. And that's it. I just refuse to watch. And I'm better. Right? Now I selectively choose. I don't get my stuff force fed to me. I choose what I want to see and I choose what I want to read. So I'm forced to going to science.com every day. Right?
Well, but hey, congratulations, Jimmy. That means you're still human. I mean, what is normal about not being upset if shown a video of a human being having their head forcibly removed from their body? Right. I mean, last time I checked, the normal response was to feel sick when you saw stuff like that. Yeah. Right?
I know. Burning humans in cages. What are you doing playing this? I don't care if it's news or not. What are you doing? And this stuff is effectively changing the population. And they know this.
Oh yeah,
man.
Yeah.
What was the Richard Dawkins movie? What was that? The Running Man. We never thought that we would be living in The Running Man, did we?
Right. We didn't think we'd be living in. I'll borrow a term that our friend Clyde Lewis uses, clown world. I don't think we ever thought we'd be living in that either. But I mean, it must be clown world if we are expected not to get sick at half of the news that we're shown every day. Yeah, I mean. And yeah, it is like Running Man or like Hunger Games. I mean, things are getting to the point where it's almost like this is all a great big game show, a sick game show. So I don't know. I mean, but I'm looking at all this happening in the world right now. And it's hard to know what to make of it. It really is. I mean, so much of it seems so unnatural. And I'm just now getting the headlines coming in. It's breaking news about this plane crash over there. Again, with a missile strike that occurred on bases where U.S. soldiers were stationed, and again, initially, as you know, they were saying that there was going to be an announcement tonight, but they're postponing that until tomorrow, which I do think is wise. Trump's already being criticized for that, but it's difficult when we're seeing this breaking news about a plane going down, coinciding with this strike, this retaliatory strike by Iran. It's difficult to see those two things and not try and connect them. We don't know if that connection exists or not. Again, it would seem very difficult for those two things to coincide in this space-time reality that we occupy. Most of us occupy at least, and not see a connection there, right? But we should abstain from leaping to that judgment. We don't know. I'm sure we'll have more details in the morning, but God, that doesn't make it really easy when you got to go to bed at night worrying about all this stuff, huh?
You know what's funny? Ricky Gervais and the Golden Globes, right? Which was what? That was Sunday night. Those were good days, weren't they? It was 2 days ago.
Those were good days 2 days ago.
2 days ago. All right. Now, when we come back, you and I were riffing before the show. And I had said to you, man, can't we just go and research the Great Pyramid or Göbekli Tepe? Do we got to do this? I just don't want to talk about this. So we're going to have a lot of fun tonight talking about wherever this conversation takes us. But I want to ask you this before we head to break. You're a musician. What's your newest guitar? What's your newest instrument? What did you pick up recently? What did you get for Christmas?
Man, I've been playing the same two guitars for close to a decade, okay? And my friends all say the same thing. They're like, man, I mean, my brother Jason, he just allowed me to test drive 5 or 6 beautiful guitars that he owns. Most of them are Telecasters. And, again, we were kind of laughing about it because I own 2 guitars. One is a Alpine White Gibson Les Paul Custom.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's not quite Alpine White anymore because anyone who owns one of those guitars knows that the paint slowly but noticeably over time does begin to fade, not fade to black in this case.
No, it's faded to beige.
Yeah, that beautiful kind of cream color, that Ingrid Malmsteen-esque color. So I kind of love it.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's my electric guitar. And then my acoustic axe is a Martin HD28 LSV. Both of them are top of the line instruments, but yeah, I don't have a massive collection. I do have a Strat in the closet. I won't lie.
Right. And I'm a Strat guy. I've got a beautiful Les Paul that, you know what, I've only played a couple of times, and it still sits as new. It's a flame top and a Honeyburst. Gorgeous guitar. But it's there to look good. It's one of those things. Don't touch it. Don't touch it. Just let it sit there. But I'm a big Strat guy. What's the Strat that's in your closet? I'm so curious.
It's funny because it's not the top of the line instrument that my other guitars are. It is a little thrown together. It's an American neck on what I presume to probably be a Pacific Rim body. And I've redone some of this thing's like a 1994 Strat. I bought it in like 99, so that's how long I've had it. Okay.
Now you got an American neck on a made in Japan body. That is a Class A Stratocaster, man.
Oh yeah, and I've got a Seymour Duncan mini humbucker that fits a single coil slot in lead position.
All right.
Yeah. Yep. And I also put some locking tuners on it. So it plays. It's what you'd call, I guess, sort of a modified Super Strat, right?
You know what I do? Okay, I'm going to let one of my secrets out. This is one of my secrets. all of my single coil Strats actually have Ingve single coils in them. So they're humbuckers, they're stacks, but they look vintage, right? And they just sound, it's incredible. They don't have that low output Strat single coil thing. They're all zingers, but nobody knows, and it's my little secret. Now, apparently, everybody knows. This is Fade to Black. Our guest tonight is Micah Hanks, and as you can see, we have definitely changed gears. We're going to talk about everything tonight. We're going to go ancient history. We're going to talk some younger Dryas. We're going to get some UFOs in there, some archaeology. We'll probably get some cryptozoology in there as well. It's Micah Hanks. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network and KGRA The Planet. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. You can follow Micah. We've got Micah's links up in Twitter right now. And I want to say really quick, June 26th and 27th, 2020, we will be at the Awakening Conference in Manchester, United Kingdom. Rita and I are heading over to Europe. Come and hang out with us and Eric Von Daniken and Richard Dolan, Nick Pope, Grant Cameron, 12 other speakers and special guests. I'll be hosting and speaking all weekend. Just go to awakeningufo.com. And Micah, really quick, what's your Twitter handle?
Very easy, at Micah Hanks on Twitter.
Man, that's too simple. Okay. Yeah. All right. We have it up there. I just couldn't, I didn't want to get it wrong. And the other thing is, it's really cool to hear your voice doing that drop. We got to get another drop cut, man. We got to get another drop cut. It's not the Gralien Report anymore. You changed it to the Micah Hanks program. Why?
Well, it's funny. I've done the Gralien Report. Gosh, when did I launch it? It was a long time ago. Okay, the blog still exists. I still feature all the shows there at the blog. But one of the things that I noticed was, first of all, as we're going to be discussing later, I had begun to take such an interest in history and archaeology over the last few years that I didn't necessarily want a name that was going to be overtly stigmatizing in terms of the kind of work I was doing. And, for many people, the whole idea behind the Gralien had been sort of a combination. I remember having this conversation with Philip Coppens years ago. I had him on the show and he had said, it is a wonderful world where we can have words like Grail and alien come together. He got it. But, a lot of people, they were like, Gray alien? What is that, right? It was a combination of two words, but I realized that, everyone would go online and instead of trying to figure out, how to type Gralien, Gralien, they just go looking for Micah Hanks podcast. Literally, you can, of course, if you're doing search engine optimization and stuff for your website, these days it's a must. if you're a web entrepreneur, if you have a website, you got to know a little about SEO. And so I'm watching the key terms and the keywords and things people are looking for. Everybody's like Micah Hanks' podcast. And so it's funny, there was a meeting with the Council of Nine, that secret illuminative group behind the scenes that governs all the actions, in my world from behind the scenes. I can neither confirm nor deny whether some members of that council are actual extraterrestrials themselves. But yeah, and they all said essentially, if you're going to do things the way that you should do them nowadays, brand your name, since your name's out there and that's what people are looking for. And so it came to pass. The vote was passed. And the Micah Hanks program was born. But yeah, the Gralien Report blog is still there. It will remain. I like to think of my show as being separate from that. But here's a fun fact, Jimmy. Did you know that before there was a Gralien Report podcast, that the original first show I did was, wait for it, it was called the Micah Hanks program?
It's so funny. Here in Hollywood, it's all about branding. It's so funny how you hear... you can be getting your hair cut, and the person cutting your hair is like, yeah, so, I've started a podcast and it's all about branding my name. It's just like it's everywhere you go now. And certainly I recognize that too as well. And it's the world that we live in. And we've been talking about the media all night and the influence of media. And if you think about how effective it has been, the ability to podcast, the ability to get your voice heard, and you write about this, you write about effective podcasting, and you've been doing this for a long time. But if you have something to say, you can do it now. Before, the rules were simple. You had to go to a radio station, do a pitch to a program director, and get denied, right? There was no other way. If you were a musician, you had to make a demo tape and go to a record company and get denied. Today, if you are a screenwriter, you can make your television series. You can distribute it for free. If you can make a movie, you can do a radio program, a TV program, you can write a book, you can do whatever you want, creativity, and not have not have somebody tell you no. Now, the key is content, right? Well, that's the key. Yeah, I mean, people are going to resonate with it or not. And if they do resonate, you're off to the races, and you can have a very successful career today. It's pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible.
I mean, I've got to give props right here to my pals, Greg and Dana Newkirk. I mean, look at what they've done with their series Hellier.
Yep.
Which came as a surprise to me. When the first season dropped, I didn't even know I was going to be in it. We had filmed the stuff that features me years ago, but I mean, it's really taken off, and they are living proof that in this day and age, if you've got a great idea and you can come up with if you can not only deliver that content, but find the right medium for doing so in a compelling way that engages your audience and captures their imaginations like Hellier does. I mean, you can sell it and you can do it, and they're doing it completely independent. And I mean, there's nothing in my mind cooler than being able to do that, right? I mean, it's pretty amazing what they've done. And lots of people are doing that these days. Heck, you and I are doing it with our shows.
Sure.
And it really is a brave new world, which is both good because it empowers people and gives them the voice that, 10 or 12 years ago, even that recently, you might not have had. But it also causes us to have to impose filters a little differently. You know what I mean?
We have to. And I think Greg and Dana are also learning by the seat of their pants about those filters. Because they're speaking of Hellier, and this goes out to anybody that wants to do something. You know what? If you've got something on your mind, friggin' do it. There's nothing stopping you. And you take a look at Hellier. It's not only the content, and they got really lucky there because that one letter to Greg, but it was chasing the breadcrumbs and the synchronicities, right? Mm-hmm. And so they got lucky with the energy that they have. Not everybody's got that, where you never take your foot off the gas. But it's not only that. It's the graphics, it's the music, it's the editing, it's the cinematography. All of it done self-funded on a budget. You're not limited to the sacrifice of production value or quality because of the lack of support from a major network. You don't necessarily need that. And you look at Hellier, and unless you know that they didn't have a monstrous budget, right? That show looks like they had a catering truck, they had a sound truck, right? They had PAs and production assistants and an unlimited budget and planes and trains, and were able to. That's not the case, But the series is a huge success, and I'm so proud of what they've been able to accomplish. And anybody can do it. That's it. You're not limited these days, and Hellier's a great example of that. And switching actually over a little bit, because we're going to stay on the same subject, but discussing UFOs today, I remember I listened to you give a presentation years ago. It doesn't matter when or where, but I remember listening to you speak, and on the subject of UFOs, and you hit me as somebody that was a little skeptical, if not a lot skeptical, but knows that there is something going on, but we're polluted with creative facts and real facts. And those out there that will push something that may not, but people believe what they're going to believe. And you did an entire presentation on this. And I sat back and I thought to myself, is Micah with us or against us? And what I've learned since then, and this is where I want your comment, what I've learned since then is one of the best ways to look at ufology in the UFO community is that you're going to believe what you want to believe, but you need to be careful as how you move forward and what you research and what you choose to go all in on. And does that describe you correctly?
Well, yeah, it does. I believe I remember the same event that you're talking about. And, the fundamental premise that I've always tried to present to the UFO community is, first of all, let's establish that I do feel that there is a phenomenon.
Right.
That needs to be studied. Now, I also recognize that when we say UFO, unidentified flying object, there are a lot of different things that might constitute a UFO. If there's an experimental government aircraft, but only a few people, due to the clandestine nature of the black budget program that produces this aircraft, only a few people actually know what that is and what its origins are. If the general public observes that object, and it's an aircraft that is capable of things that far exceed known aircraft, we're all going to look at that and go, hot dang, there's a UFO. If we observe ball lightning, especially at a distance, we're going to see a light moving through the sky and behaving irrationally and then just zapping out. And, a couple of atmospheric scientists might look at that and say, that was probably ball lightning. But, maybe the average observer who is not used to seeing ball lightning like that, they're going to look at it and go, whoa, that wasn't a star. That didn't look like a meteor. What was that? Then there are those observations of things that seem to fall neither into the category of man-made nor natural, right? And if anyone reviews carefully the anecdotal data that comprises the history of the subject which we call UFO studies, I refrain from calling it ufology because to append ology onto the end of it would seem to denote that we are trying to apply science to it. I have always advocated scientific-minded studies and critiques of the UFO phenomenon because only through scientific study will we really proceed in what we know and what we're trying to ascertain about the phenomenon. But what's interesting, Jimmy, is I think we're still at this point where we're in the pre-scientific stage. If we look at philosophers like Thomas Kuhn and others, who have talked about the scientific process and philosophically speaking, really what it takes for a subject to be recognized broadly so that scientists actually take it seriously and begin to study it, I would recognize UFOs as being a topic that is sort of on the cusp of stepping over into a realm where scientists are now beginning to look at it seriously. But up until around 2017, we might argue that most scientists would not look at it. Many had. Jacques Vallée comes to mind. A number of others do. But Of course, Hynek, both at the same time and even a little before Hynek, had done the same thing. Before Vallée, J. Allen Hynek, although they were colleagues. But again, there have been some notable scientists who have looked at the problem prior to the modern era. But the point I'm making is that most would not. And they would not because they do not perceive the UFO phenomenon as being either a credible subject, worthy of science being applied to it. They didn't think that there really was a phenomenon and that this was all just the works of cranks, weirdos, and those who are trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and hoax, maybe for profit, right? Create hoaxes and try and profit from this so they could get attention, they could get on television, whatever. That sort of very closed-minded scientific attitude was more often applied to it. And even those scientists who might have thought that there was something more to it, they would fall in step with that ideology because they were, and this is important sociologically, they would be afraid of being judged by their peers if they did not, which is a big factor here. For us to really begin to move out of the pre-scientific stage of UFO research, we have required data the likes of which is now only beginning to be forthcoming. And yes, these three remarkably ambiguous videos, but nonetheless videos which appear to show something that the U.S. Navy filmed and cannot identify. The ATFLIR pod systems the Raytheon company produced, they are helping us ascertain some details. And what little it actually tells us is less relevant than the fact that these things appear to have behavioral characteristics that are beyond the scope of known aviation, or aerospace technology. So now I think that with what little instrumental data is forthcoming, that paired with the existing data, the anecdotal data, eyewitness accounts, and the historical accounts with relation to UFOs over the last several decades, and some would say going back even further, I think all of these factors are helping move this subject into a realm where now scientists, and I actually have spoken with many scientists who still don't come out in broad daylight and just, raise their voice and sing, hey, I'm into UFOs. Many of them still keep a low profile, but many scientists now have reached out to me, and we have had some very candid conversations about their interest in this topic. So that I'm hopeful for. But in relation to why I say UFO research instead of ufology, with the body of data that we have, even if we aren't necessarily employing scientists and applying science to the study of this phenomenon, as I have always advocated that we should, what's the one thing you can really be an expert, or if you're going to study UFOs, what's the one thing you can be an expert in? Well, I would say the history of the phenomenon, right? If we can document the development of thought, the key instances where, based on especially multiple eyewitness encounters and observations that have merit, that are well recorded, and which may also contain some data in support of the eyewitness observation, if we can document those things in a historical context, that is a significant contribution also toward the furtherment of our scientific understanding of this phenomenon. So that is something I've been engaged in doing pretty actively for the last several months, going back and starting, way back in the day and moving forward and trying to ascertain, what is this phenomenon? And one big takeaway, coming back to how you described it there at the outset, one big takeaway, Jimmy, has been that apart from the apparent presence of a phenomenon, there is the human interpretation of it. I mean, humans are very complex. It's just like what we talked about in the opening segment with politics, with international issues and foreign policy. There is the event, and then there are the levels of interpretation, the filters that humans have to try and work through in order to understand said event. And that is as fascinating to me as the UFO phenomenon, but that makes it very complex to try and do a truly objective study of the phenomenon. Nonetheless, I think a phenomenon exists, and I think that we're definitely making some progress, and that a lot of that has occurred in the last few years.
It certainly has. And if we go back to look at history, recent history, and that goes back to the creation of the Drake equation, or Enrico Fermi and the Fermi paradox, or the way that Carl Sagan looked at things, and certainly Jacques, who I have a great amount of respect for, and J. Allen Hynek, in that they didn't have back then the data that we have acquired since 1998. In the last 20 years, 20 short years, we went from, because Sagan and Fermi and all of those cats didn't know if there were other planets outside of our own solar system. They wondered if there was another one like ours in the universe. Well, today, we now know, that in our Milky Way, not the universe, in our Milky Way, we have 1 trillion planets. That every star that you look at in the night sky, when you walk out in your yard and you look up, every single star has a planet. They didn't have that data before. And the other part of that they have extrapolated from those numbers, which are ginormous, and this is the science side, this is cosmology, this is the astronomy side of it. Out of that 1 trillion planets, 100 billion to 200 billion are Earth-like rocky planets. Now, that's where things get upset. And you take that number, the same formula, and you apply it to the galaxies in the observable universe. Not the entire universe, because we don't know what's out there. It's now expanded beyond our vision. We have no idea how many galaxies there actually are. But there's between 500 billion and 1 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, each with 500 billion stars, right? And 500 billion planets. Now, that's where these numbers get out of control. So the Fermi paradox and the Drake equation and the way that Carl Sagan looked at everything was wrong. They didn't know that. Their view on intelligent life out there and the possibilities of it would have been vastly different if they knew what we knew today. And that's the part of science when it comes to the UFO phenomenon and intelligent life in the universe, and are we alone? Those questions start to answer themselves. And that's why it's an exciting time for ufology, my friend. I know that the proof of everything is going to come from science. We can't give any more eyewitness accounts, right?
Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, that hasn't worked, right? All the video and photographs and abductions and contact, we've been trying that angle for a very long time. I have seen things I can't explain, but that's not good enough. I know that the phenomenon is real. I think the proof for it, for the community and for the world, is going to come from science, and we are right on the brink.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Science is the path toward understanding any phenomena. It is a process that has been developed very slowly, born out of philosophy and, first in its earliest iterations really referred to as a branch of philosophy, natural philosophy. And if only the philosophers who were the earliest, really the first philosophers were the first scientists, but if, as science begins to evolve as we know it today out of philosophy, if those philosophers of that era, the Enlightenment era, and Newton himself, if they could see the way that scientists today talk about philosophy, they say philosophy is dead. They would probably be shocked. They would be shocked at the level of sophistication. But what has changed so much? I think it really has a lot to do with the way that technology has expanded and how technology and technological growth has run parallel to scientific understanding. That has been really a game changer. And hey, wise men once said, if the game is rigged, change the game. I think that scientists have been doing that for a long time. But, coming back to Fermi and Sagan and guys like that, you're right. They were wrong in a lot of their fundamental assessments, probably, even though a lot of people still cite their work. And I'm not saying that they were wrong about everything. I read a great article at Scientific American the other day about the Fermi paradox. As a thought exercise, it's still correct, but I would guess, and as time goes on, science is going to help us show this demonstrably, that they were incorrect, but it was due to a lack of data necessary at the time to be able to make a full assessment of the phenomena that they were commenting on. A good example is Carl Sagan early on being an advocate of essentially, he called it paleo contact, but what he was describing was essentially the same thing that is, present in the work of Eric von Daniken and all the ancient astronaut theorists. And the reason that he stepped away from that, despite having authored papers and having given addresses and, talks and lectures about it, after a few years, he steps away from it because he says that a careful review of archaeological and historical records gave very little indication that this sort of contact in early times had occurred, and therefore he backed away from it, and he was satisfied with that. I would, in fairness, put forth the idea not to try and any more legitimize ancient astronaut theories than to delegitimize anything that Sagan said, but I think that it's a little more complex than just, well, I reviewed the data and found no evidence. I actually think that part of what it was that Sagan, as a scientist, was putting forward what he believed to be a very, scientific and reasonable, premise. Hey, if alien life exists, humans, sophisticated, technologically savvy humans have only been around for a little while, and with, 13 billion plus years behind us on this planet, the idea that it was visited in ancient times is far greater than the idea that visitation has occurred within the short time frame that technologically human beings would be capable of even recognizing a visitation if it occurred. And therefore, he wanted to look to the past. I think, and this is my personal theory, and I've actually talked with von Daniken about this too. My opinion is that Sagan had actually been influenced by the fact that guys like von Daniken rose to public notoriety for advocating those hypotheses, but because von Daniken, of course, was not a scientist himself and would never claim to be, I think Sagan felt that the topic was becoming stigmatized and that he might have had to distance himself from it, and that call that a sociological factor, if you will, whatever, but I think that was probably an influence on Sagan turning his back on that topic. I spoke with the late Stanton Friedman about Sagan as well, and they had both been in the same graduating class at Chicago University, and they were good friends. I didn't know how good friends. I asked Stan about that, and he said, we were great friends. He said, I was up there, near his home, and he had me over for coffee cake one afternoon before a talk I gave. And I said, okay, you guys really were good friends. And he told me that talking with Sagan about the UFO thing, he said, Carl, surely you haven't ruled out this possibility, and take this for what it is, but this is what Stan said that Sagan told him. They're both deceased now, so we can't really ask either of them, but Stan told me that Sagan said, of course, I'm interested in that possibility that the UFO phenomenon, whatever that may be, actually represents extraterrestrial visitation. I've never ruled that out, but he said, I can't just go out there and run my mouth and talk about it the way that you do. He says, I would lose funding. This would get somebody in trouble. This would raise this issue here. He said it's essentially complicated. So if that's to be believed, and I don't have any reason to think that it's not, what Stan seems to indicate is that Sagan maintained that interest, but like a lot of, and I'm sure he did. I mean, I'm certain he did, but like a lot of scientists, he had to approach it very carefully. And that, I think, supports the idea that the media attention that the subject began to get, especially with the publication of Chariots of the Gods and von Daniken's rise to prominence in the public sphere, I think that probably influenced Sagan, as it has a lot of scientists. They feel like if that's a popular idea, but it's not one that is being approached by the scientific community, I can have nothing to do with it. I hope that we are beginning to see a shift in that attitude, because I do feel that at the root of the UFO phenomenon, putting everybody's pet theories and belief systems aside, I feel that there is a phenomenon worthy of being studied. And back to your point, science is going to be the way that we learn the most about it and further our knowledge about it.
Let's take our break right here. Our guest tonight is Micah Hanks. Yeah, you can already tell it's one of those conversations. More with Micah after this short break. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Stay with us. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. You can subscribe to our podcast. If you have missed a live show, you can catch the live show every single night, but for free. But if you missed the live show, get our podcast. It is just $2 per month. Go to jimmychurchradio.com. Click on the podcast banner. We have over 1,160. Unbelievable. I'll say it again. Over 1,160 archive shows right there for just $2 a month. How do you get to that number, Micah? 1,000 shows, right?
Oh, God, yeah. That's a question, right?
That's 1,000 shows. Unbelievable. And it's not going to be long. We're going to be saying 2,000. And when you combine everything else, it's an astronomical number. And you've been with us since the very beginning. And I do want to thank you not only for your support, for being a friend, and the community respects you so much. And one of the things that I want to discuss right now is your recent trip to the Azores in Portugal. Mm-hmm. I happened to catch, this is a couple of months ago, I happened to catch a documentary on one of my apps on, Amazon, whatever, Nat Geo or Science Channel. It was a research trip to the Azores, to a couple of caves and some systems there that would indicate. Now we need to talk with a geographical sense where these islands are located, because it's pretty significant. But putting that aside, the Azores are a recent discovery. It's a modern part of civilization, and it appears that the islands were visited and inhabited pre-Columbian. And I didn't know about this. I'm watching this documentary. I'm like, why aren't people talking about this? Why isn't there research going on? Why isn't there an archaeological dig there? The local university is trying to raise funds to get up there and to examine what is going on. But it's right there in front of everybody. And if it is what it appears to be, and you were just there looking at this, that is a game changer. That changes history, doesn't it?
It really does. Again, the general consensus is that during the Age of Discovery, of course, the Azorian Islands were discovered by the Portuguese, but there is mounting evidence that may suggest that they were known earlier. And yes, this is partly what compelled me to want to go there. I had a friend who wanted to go to Portugal, and primarily she was looking at the possibility of wanting to live there for part of the year and didn't want to go by herself. And so she needed some muscle. She says, come be my traveling companion. And I said, well, here's an idea. I'd love to go to Portugal and hang out on the mainland, because you got to keep in mind, even if you're just a tourist, the food, the culture, everything's so wonderful. If you're an archaeology enthusiast, right there in Lisbon, or Lisboa as they call it there are a number of wonderful history and archaeology museums. But I posited the idea. I said, if we were to plan a trip, what would you think about jumping over to the Azores? And she said, oh, that sounds great. And so we did. And I have to say that, in the island chain, there are a lot of different aspects. You can't just go to one island and see everything. And we were on the island of São Miguel, in the general area of Ponta Delgada, but we rented a car. And so I was driving a little small European SUV all over that island. And I'll tell you, first and foremost, a lot of people, when they think about the Azores, again, we're talking about a small island chain which are located along the mid-Atlantic ridge, not right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Azorian Islands, if you looked on a map, are going to be out a little bit,
a third of the way to the United States. But it's you can, let's just call it the middle of the Atlantic. It's a long way from anything.
Well, it is. It's a really long way from anything. And again, just think of this as being like the joints of planet Earth. There is a mountain chain that goes along a curvy, and what's beautiful is, again, if you look at a map, you can see where the west coast of Africa would fit neatly into the little cavity that is created on the eastern coast between North America and South America, beckoning all the way back to the times of Pangaea and the idea of a supercontinent that our geologists tell us about today. But Out there in the middle, there is a underwater mountain chain, the peaks of which at its various locales actually extend above Atlantic waters. And the most prominent area in the actual middle of the Atlantic is the Azorian Island chain as we know it. Now, what's really interesting about this is from a philosophical standpoint, being the philosophy lover that I am, I mean, I've read a lot of Plato, Jimmy. And I take Plato's writings to be philosophical discourses, right? I take them to be thought exercises.
Sure.
But it is interesting that he's talking about, 9,000 was the sum of the years that has passed since the war that was waged between Athens and those who dwelt beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And it's interesting because if you look at the Azores, and I'm not saying that, because I know a lot of people endorse the idea, they say Atlantis was out there, it existed. A lot of people are like, that's completely nonsense. I fully understand the scholarly perspective in terms of what...
There's a but here. There's a but. I can hear it.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
Okay.
I fully understand the scholarly perspective, but the point is that if you look at the bathospheric data,
yes,
ocean floor data, and again, it's simple. Go on Google Satellite or Google Earth and look up Sao Miguel Island, S-A-O, Saint Miguel, but Sao Miguel Island in the Azores. It's still Portuguese territory and hence Portuguese language, but you'll see that the island chain, of course, below the Atlantic surface, was a larger island complex. And at the time of the end of the last ice age, the Pleistocene, around the time of the Younger Dryas, in other words, when ocean levels were lower and there was greater ice accumulation at the North and South Poles, much more of the land that is now underwater would have been exposed. And so there would have been, rather than a small scattering of islands, there would have been a larger scattering of islands, or maybe even a larger I don't want to call it a continent, but at very least a larger island network.
It would have been as big as like Spain.
At very least.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And you can clearly see the outline definition of that. I've always gone back and looked at the Azores, and you can see the peaks that are now islands of these mountains. But there is a definition of a landmass there with a lower sea level that this would be not. It's not a continent. Continent would be incorrect, but a big ass island. Absolutely. At the gates of Hercules. It's right there.
Well, a little west, yeah. But now here's the thing. What interested me about all this is, I'm merely acknowledging, call it a synchronicity, but Plato's talking about a general time frame. And I have to also admit to having, especially in the document Timaeus, where he is describing the visit made by Solon, well in advance of Plato's time.
Right.
The Athenian statesman Solon goes to North Africa, and he's in Egypt, and he is, talking with these old priests. And he's asked about, their earliest records, and he is discussing the oldest known records and everything. And this elderly priest named Sonkis of Sais says, "Oh, Solon, you Athenian statesmen, you're like children in your mind. You have no concept of antiquity and the great things that your people, the Athenians, did in the ancient times." It's a fascinating story. If you read it, just take it for what it is, even if it's just Plato, giving us this story for again, a philosophical treatise to, teach us a broader truth. It's a captivating story. I can see why it is endured like it is. But what really got me thinking about the Azores actually had to do with a conversation with Randall Carlson. The Seven Ages team and I, Jason and James and I, we'd gone down last fall to visit Randall at his home near Atlanta. And we were talking about this, and he has a lecture that he gives, probably one of several, about Atlantis. And if you're hanging out with Randall Carlson, you go to dinner and you get back to his place at about 9 or 10, and then 2 o'clock in the morning rolls around and you're still sitting there, and Gandalf Carlson,
right?
He never turns it off. He keeps going. And he is just, it's like a download from the Mother Throne talking with Randall. But
no doubt
he was talking about all of the geological information about how that island complex, we might say, would have looked during the end of the Pleistocene. And it got me thinking. I was like, well, this is really neat. He lays out a pretty good case that there was a larger, fairly, significant portion of the land that would have been exposed at the end of the Pleistocene, because taking into account a few factors, not only were sea levels lower, but also there's what's referred to as isostatic rebound, okay? And this is when ice melts. If you got an ice sheet like those that accumulated around the poles during the last ice age, during the Pleistocene. It causes a superficial uplift on portions of the land adjacent to where the ice and the pressure exerted by that ice rests, okay? And so as that ice melts and those ice caps begin to recede, the Earth actually flattens back out, and this is the isostatic rebound. Well, the opposite effect at the height of the ice age would have been that with the greatest accumulation of ice on the poles, it actually exerts pressure on the Earth, which would have caused that superficial uplift and likely would have caused pressures around the mid-Atlantic ridge that would have even caused a greater thrust upward of that landmass if one existed at that time, which, of course, those islands are still there today. Obviously, one did. Geologically speaking, that was fascinating to me, but it got me thinking, well, is there archaeological evidence? Has anybody bothered to look? What's happening down there in the Azores? So I was in contact with albeit briefly, we weren't able to arrange to meet while I was there because he was on one of the adjacent islands, and this time of the year the ferries aren't running, so I've got to go back. But I was in touch with Felix Rodriguez, who is a scientist with the University of the Azores, who has found a number of petroglyphs, stone carvings, and also amphora, which are these sort of underground compartments or cave-like. Some of them are actually above ground or partially above ground, but they're built of stone, which resemble Roman amphora or amphorae. And he believes that the petroglyph carvings in the same area on Terceira Island may date back to the Bronze Age. And so he and I were corresponding while I'm down there in the Azores, and he says, you got to come back down here. Let me know when is a convenient time for you. Anytime, I'll take you out there and show you these. And he's not the only archaeologist who is following this line of thought. I believe Nuno Ribeiro is another who may be on the Portuguese mainland, but he has also published a few papers about what he believes is evidence of Roman presence on those islands. But the most compelling story, Jimmy, is the one about, and there's a report that actually was published, I think, all the way back in, it was probably, 1778. There was this report that was published, and I think actually the Royal Society of Sciences and Letters in Gothenburg, Johann Franz Podolin was the Portuguese-born Swede who published this. He gives this account of a pot, and being the nerd that I am, I actually found a facsimile version of the account and actually conducted my own translation with the help of Google software. But the account that's given in this, it's the only known report, but it describes a great storm that comes along and washes out a beach adjacent to an old building on the island of Corvo, which is the most northwesterly oriented island in the island chain in the Azores. And this little black kettle, a little pot, was found full of Carthaginian coins that dated back to around 200 BC. And there are even drawings in the account given by Podolin, but these coins, it's been a very contentious story because, of course, people are like, well, if there were Carthaginian coins on Corvo, then presumably somebody sailed up there. And these dated back to 200 BC. So, I mean, they at least, were sometime after that, but probably did date back to earlier times than the official discovery by Portuguese navigators of the Azores. Now, skeptics have looked at it and said, well, but there's also a town called Corvo on the mainland, I believe in North Africa. And they said maybe the pot was actually found there. It wasn't actually found out there on the island. There's more to the legend, though, too. The legend also tells of and many old maps and portolans actually depict this, a statue within the vicinity of the island of Corvo. The statue, they said, was reminiscent of, the dress and demeanor of the Moors, of a Moorish individual. These would have been European, Islamic Europeans at the time. And they said that the statue depicted a man pointing off to the west, and that would have been out there on that island also. And that maps and portolans also indicated this. Now, they believe that could have been a reference to a stone, a actual rock outcrop on the island of Corfu that might have represented or resembled a person or a sort of anthropomorphic shape. But it's fascinating to me because the combination of all these stories, the idea of a statue out there on this island pointing off to the west, a pot of coins from 200 BC, and then the modern archaeological discoveries. If only one of those things existed in this broader narrative, right, I might say, okay, maybe not. But there seems to be mounting evidence that is suggestive. And then let's step over into known history also, because a deep reading of the history actually indicates Portuguese royalty instructing these navigators not to, hey, go out there, see what you guys can find. But the terminology actually is go and find the islands. And we think about all the existing narratives, not just Atlantis, but we've got the legends of the Fortunate Isles, St. Brennan's Isle. We have the traditions among Mesoamerica of Aztlan, this island home that they sailed from. So many of these ancient cultures have this tradition of an island out there in the middle of the Atlantic. It seems very likely to me, whatever we want to make of that and however much we want to actually apply that to legends like Atlantis, that the Portuguese did know that there was an island chain out there. That probably had served as the impetus for the discovery, the official discovery of the Azores. But my guess is, like you've alluded, that the archaeological evidence is going to point to a much earlier, at very least discovery, possibly even temporary habitation there.
Did you go to any of the? I saw 2 caves. I've heard reports of more. Did you go to the two caves that were apparently they're man-made? They're constructed of cut stone. Mm-hmm. The caves themselves haven't been fully investigated. This was up to about a year ago when this documentary was made. But did you go to these 2 caves? And if you did, what did you see?
I didn't go to those caves. Those, I believe, however, are on Terceira Island, and those would be the ones that I corresponded with the scientist from the University of the Azores, Felix Rodriguez, about.
Yes.
Yeah, and these are fascinating. Unfortunately, again, I was looking at every option. I was hoping to be able to catch a boat this time of the year. They don't have ferries running. I would have had to have flown in order to get there, and with my schedule, I just wasn't able to do it. So I was corresponding with Dr. Rodriguez about this, and of course, he's like, if you can make it down here, come on, I'm going to take you out there and show you this stuff. So my current plan is to go back to the Azores and hopefully visit all of the islands, because there are unique things at each of them. Now, on São Miguel, where I was staying, there's this very unique area which is called Sete Cidades in the Portuguese language, which means the 7 cities. It's actually the caldera, okay? It's the remnant of a collapsed volcano. These are all volcanic islands, and so my hosts at the bed and breakfast where I'm staying are telling me all about this, and that there are these unique, very ancient archways up there that look like Roman architecture. I don't think that they actually are. If there were indeed anything so obvious as Roman architecture on the islands that could be studied and discerned as and the provenance could be established that they were indeed that old, it would be a pretty clean-cut deal, I think. These are probably early 19th century, late 18th century structures, I would imagine. But it was funny because that's what drew me to the area. But I go up to Sete Cidades and I drive up into the this sounds dangerous. It's not an active volcano, fortunately. So I drive up into the former volcano, the caldera, and I'm driving down, and there are these 2 beautiful lakes down there. And I'm losing daylight because I just heard about this, and the sun's about to set. I've only got about an hour. And there's the Laguna Azul and the Laguna Verde, which are, of course, the Blue Lake and the Green Lake. The Green Lake, as the name entails, has an algal bloom in it that causes it to have a greenish appearance. And then the Blue Lake immediately adjacent to it doesn't have the same issue, and so it's a blue lake, and they have starkly different colors, especially in warmer weather. So it's quite striking in itself. But I go up there and I'm taking in the landscape, and I come back and I speak to Duarte, the gentleman who runs the B&B that I'm staying at, and he says, what's interesting is that there were core samples that were taken from one of those 2 lakes up there in the Sete Cidades. And he says that the cores, they drill down and they actually extract sedimentary layers from the soil deep beneath that lake system. And he says what they found was what appeared to be seeds that had been cultivated. In other words, what appeared to be evidence of pre-agriculture or early agriculture that was conducted in that area at some time, but in the sedimentological region in which they were found. In other words, the layer of the soil extracted, this would have been really, really old. I asked him, I said, okay, who can I talk to about this? And yet again, he says, this doesn't, because you won't find anything online about this, Jimmy, but he says there are researchers right now at the University of the Azores who are conducting studies trying to determine indeed if there were human settlements or habitation in much earlier times at that location. So yet again, there seems to be some very compelling evidence. I mean, we'd have to figure out a lot more, and I realize there's going to be an aversion that many are going to have, because what does this require? It requires rewriting the history books. But to me, it's not all that strange that people were getting around, and that maybe, a couple of thousand years ago, that navigation was sophisticated enough that people look at the Antikythera mechanism. I'm sure these people were far more capable of navigating and sailing and discovering islands like the Azores than we would give them credit for.
Yeah,
so it's really not that surprising to me.
Yeah, and what was very interesting in this documentary that I got lucky in finding it, but the film crew that is with Felix, right, and they're going through the cave system, and it's pretty cool looking. Right.
Oh, yeah.
It really is. Anyway, so the director turns to Felix and he goes, "This is incredible. Who knows about this?" And Felix goes, "Me." And he goes, "Yeah, but, what about the events? What about the archaeological? Nobody knows, man. It's just me. It's just me. I'm showing you for the first time. I need to try to get the funding. We have a small university here. We have no money. And I'm out here doing this on my feet. I have to walk here and go and find these things. Nobody knows except for myself." And I was astounded. Micah, I was blown away. And would this rewrite history? Absolutely. But I would think that there would be a majorly funded university in the UK or Spain or Portugal or the United States that would go out there and check this out, because it's very interesting.
Let's very briefly just touch on Göbekli Tepe in relation to this, because there's a great corollary here. Back in the 1990s, when the first site, there weren't excavations at all. There were just site surveys that were done at Göbekli Tepe. I believe they were archaeologists with the University of Chicago. They go out there, they find some, flint chips and things, evidence of human stoneworking up there, and they don't think there's much to it. And they're like, okay, well, that's that. We've surveyed the site, and here's our site report, and there it is. And it wasn't until decades later when Klaus Schmidt goes up there and he's like, the locals ascribe this almost mystic significance to this weird-looking little hill. Let's excavate and see what happens. Turns out it's an artificial hill, and not only an artificial hill, but it is a ceremonial site that bespeaks sophistication, in the high-relief sculpture and in the stonework. I mean, it's pre-pottery, it's pre-agriculture, but baby, it's more sophisticated than Stonehenge.
That's right. And I've got to take a break here in 15 seconds. Yeah. What's even more fascinating, before Klaus Schmidt, or how he got into the picture, the farmer that owned the hill had his, he's up there trying to farm the land, and he keeps hitting this rock. Right? Yeah. Keeps hitting this rock, and so he tries to dig it out, and he can't. He's going deeper and deeper. Then he sees the inscriptions on the side, and he almost, if he hadn't have been frustrating and plowing his fields, frustrated with that, Göbekli Tepe might have never been fully discovered. He called the university there in Istanbul and said, "Hey, you guys got to come out here and check out this rock because there's writing on it." And that without any of that, what if he would have blown it up with dynamite? And what I mean? And just got rid of it so he could plow his fields.
Right. Yeah, but the scientists had been there, and they were like, okay, well, nothing to see here. Move along. The guy with the plow is the one that makes the discovery. Right?
That's right. Let's take a break right here. Excuse me, cough button. Our guest tonight, Micah Hanks. Oh, man. Great conversation, Micah. We will continue with all of it right after this short break. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, George Noory. George Noory joins us, and George, 13 years of doing your own thing over at Coast, 17 years total, and now you're on Fade to Black, and our numbers are bigger than Coast to Coast AM. How does that make you feel?
Do we really have to go through this again, Jimmy? We've been over it so many times. You'll never be as big as me. You know that, don't you?
Well, you keep telling me that you've done 4,000 shows and that I'm just the young kid on the block, but we're coming after you, man.
It's poppycock. You're going to stay a weekend host, Jimmy. Sorry to break it to you.
Oh, man. Micah, the first time I heard you do George was one of I hadn't laughed that hard. and you kept it going. And then I went and I listened to some of your recordings. And has George ever heard any of it?
Oh yeah, it's I'm not as good at it as I used to be, but the truth is, when I worked in radio and I was a voice talent, I was in the creative services department. We had an award-winning department. John Anderson, known around these parts as the voice of the mountains, had produced a ad campaign for a local burrito spot, Urban Burrito, that literally won a national award at Clear Channel Corporate. Advertising campaign of the year. And so I studied under him. He was my Jedi master, John. And of course, we were a Coast to Coast affiliate station. And so we all, heard Coast to Coast and everything. And, that iconic opening, from the gateway to the west, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. And, when you work in radio, again, I used to be even better at it, but that was something you had to be able to do. There weren't enough voices in our little Clear Channel cluster. And so when we had to be able to voice these spots, or we did a creative spot, that was our big, claim to fame. We would try to do creative services, not just this weekend at blank, fill in the auto dealership or whatever. We tried to tell a story with an ad that took and again, there's a great book by Roy Williams, the advertiser, not the coach, called The Wizard of Ads. And it's all about this. The whole idea is take the listener's mind away from whatever they're doing and put them in a story and then sell them a watch, right? And, that's a very interesting discipline, advertising to study because it teaches you so much about human psychology and all these different things. But, for me as a kid working in radio, I just thought, hey, this is cool. And I love being able to work behind a microphone. You had to learn how to do voices, though, man. I mean, that was just requisite. So we were all doing voices and stuff. It was, it was a lot of cutting up and a lot of having fun back in those days at the old Radio Ranch News Radio 570 WWNC, the Talk of the Mountains.
Right.
Remember it fondly.
Well, see, I've always looked up to people that could do great impersonations and would be able to change their vocal cords, because that's what you're doing. I can't do that. I've got one voice. That's it. There's nothing else to me, man. I am so one-dimensional, and I've just always had great respect. Rich Little and all of those cats, that were so good at it. Okay, I want to get back to Gobekli Tepe, George.
But before we get to Gobekli Tepe, now listen, I'll tell you, if you got one good voice, and you can do one good voice, that means you're you. You'd be a good politician, Jimmy. In fact, if you decide you want to run, I'll endorse you now. I'll do that. I'll put my name behind. I don't know if that would really help you. As long as we don't bring up Epstein, it'll probably be all right.
See, I can't do that. I have such respect for that. I wish somebody out there, some celebrity, had my voice, because then I could imitate that. But
Gobekli Tepe.
I can't do it. Going back to Gobekli Tepe. How many Gobekli Tepes out there that are yet to be discovered under the sands of the deserts or under the oceans, buried in dirt? I mean, Gobekli Tepe was deliberately buried. How many more out there are to be discovered?
Well, probably quite a few. In fact, the discovery of Gobekli Tepe is not a standalone discovery. There is what's called Bonkuklu Tarla, very close to Gobekli Tepe, but this site complex actually dates back to earlier, perhaps, than Gobekli Tepe, and this was just recently reported by probably the Turkish Ministry of Antiquities. I'm going to pull up an article here. I believe, I've got one here. And this was just announced late last year. December 5th is the date of this article, but it says Turkish archaeologists have unearthed an ancient site in the southern province of Mardin that is likely older than Gobekli Tepe, recognized as the oldest temple in the world. So again, this site is going to be another game changer, Bonkuklu Tarla, which means beaded field. Gobekli Tepe, of course, Potbelly Hill, but this just goes to show there are actually other Gobekli Tepes, and they might not all be right there in Anatolia, Turkey, either. There have been some whispers about similarly ancient sites in other parts of the world. Graham Hancock and certain writers who are considered pseudo-archaeologists have written about this. Now, again, I point that out because I work with a lot of people in actual scientific archaeology, and a lot of them actually have a lot of respect for Graham Hancock. I do too. He would never claim to being an archaeologist. He's actually had a lot of, I think it's fair to say criticisms of archaeology.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But here's the whole thing. There's always some debate, some brouhaha going on. The academics saying, well, no, he has no place in what we do. I would say actually to the contrary, what people like Graham Hancock do is they do challenge paradigms and they do cause people to think outside the box. And then when we do find sites like Göbekli Tepe that do indicate that, we have to engage in radical shifts in thinking and revisions even at times in terms of what we thought we knew, and we learn that there are certain things that Graham Hancock had either closely predicted or had been saying all along which do come to fruition, it really does show that I think that there's a space in between academia and quote-unquote pseudo-archaeology where, great minds who are equally invested in just trying to discern the truth can meet. They don't always have to agree. But again, Graham plays a very necessary role in all of this by pushing those paradigms. And really, more broadly speaking, the study of anomalies does that. It may be what Charles Fort called the damned facts, the excluded datum, that we find in some dusty old textbook. That one little excluded fact may be the thing that when we finally turn the light of science on that and we go, okay, well, what's this? We ignored it for decades, but now here's this thing. And then it opens up a whole new paradigm. Again, Göbekli Tepe was that. It was ignored for really probably centuries. There had been a tradition, a cultural tradition, that there was significance to this hill. The locals seemed to know that there was something going on, and that's often the case when it comes to indigenous cultures and their knowledge of their environment. But we, ever mighty Western scientists, come into the picture and we look and we don't see anything, and we go back home, and decades later, we find what at the time was the most significant archaeological discovery in the world, and now we're finding sites adjacent to it or nearby in the region that are even older. So, yeah, quite obviously these paradigms need to be pushed, but it is, I would argue, at times the anomaly that helps us do that. We don't study anomalies just for the sake of being mysterious and finding weird things, spooky things, unexplained mysteries. You get to a point where you can enjoy television and reading books about this stuff all you want, but if you're going to be a serious researcher, it is incumbent upon the serious researcher to look at those anomalies and do so both with respect for good science and the consensus viewpoints, but also with an open mind. Always do so, no matter what, responsibly, and try to carry out your research responsibly and academically. But again, the sincere and responsible study of anomalies, I think, pushes those boundaries, makes new discoveries, and that helps reshape our reality, which right now I think, in truth, in light of what we opened the show discussing with the issues we see in the Middle East, we could use a little conscious evolution, a little, mind-expanding discovery. If we all could engage in a little of that and we could broaden our concept of the world and our place in it, maybe we'd all be a little better for that, don't you think?
Well, this is what supports what you are saying. The arguments that occurred at the press conference in 1992 in San Diego between Robert Schoch and John Anthony West and the rest of the geologists that get together each year for their annual conference, where the presentation was there for the dating of the Sphinx, and their television special was airing, and this controversy was laid out. And they had said to Schoch back then and to Jaws, they said, look, give us any evidence of anything before Giza, before 3000 BC. Give us evidence of any culture carving a rock and making a megalithic structure. Then we have an argument. But until then, the dating stands. What they didn't know was that 3 years later, Göbekli Tepe and Klaus Schmidt hit the scene. Had that debate happened 3 years later, it's a different press conference. It's a different discussion. But they didn't want to hear anything about anything because they were firmly planted in the dogma that everything started at Giza. And there was no evidence anywhere on this planet of any intelligent civilization constructing any monuments or temples or any megalithic structures. What changed everything was not only did it predate Giza, not by 100 years, Not by 1,000 years. 8,000 years before Giza, right? How much more evidence do you need for something like this? And that's where, if it wasn't for Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval and Robert Schoch and John Anthony West and others, Andrew Collins, looking at Orion and the alignment and the erosion and the changes that were happening on Giza to present something that could have happened at 10,000 BC, at the end of the last ice age. They excused all of it as pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience and crazy town, tinfoil hat craziness, when it turned out that all of them were right. And that's the crazy part about it. And that's where science, Micah, for me, science is supposed to be about asking questions. Science is supposed to be about a series of corrections. Right? That's what it is. It's a series of corrections. We go back, at one point, the Earth was the center of the known universe. Well, what did we do with that? We corrected it. We didn't stay on that. We know that that's not true. And that's what science is. And that's why when in archaeology and anthropology and geology, when you look at all of this, just go back, think outside the box, and maybe correct something from the past. It's really that simple. And nothing is absolute, is it?
Well, yeah, maybe some things are, but again, it requires science to be able to prove those things as being absolute. Now, maybe
give me an example. Give me an example of something that is absolute.
I think that we could probably look at certain physical laws of the universe. Most, for instance, thermodynamic laws are pretty absolute. Although,
but they've all changed.
They all changed. Earlier ideas changed to make room for those scientific, what we consider laws.
Adjustments, right? Yes, and proof of concept. Yes.
Right, and a postmodern philosopher might argue that, but see, even those things might be subject to change too. See, I see what you're saying, actually, and again, this was the whole point that I don't consider myself a postmodern philosopher, but I look at all philosophy and I try to take it all of it with a grain of salt, right? So while learning from it, but Michel Foucault. Foucault. I always mix his name up, but Foucault, when he wrote about the he really was more a historian of science, but ended up becoming really one of the leading philosophers of his era. What he was doing is he's going back and he's looking at how, the best science of the day with the mental health that was being provided for people in France at that time, they didn't necessarily benefit from it. It may have been cutting edge science, but it was antiquated at best by today's standards, and often they fared quite poorly with the imposition of that. And so in writing about that, he makes the fundamental argument that the very best scientific knowledge of any particular era may not necessarily be to the benefit of people, right? And what began really as history of science goes into philosophy, and that argument remains, and that's kind of remained a fundamental tenet. And I've seen others who, whether or not arguing for postmodern philosophy, they nonetheless raise the point that, again, in this era, all the things that we think and that we take for granted as being scientific laws and being absolute constants in the universe, time and time again, if we look back at the history of science, we've seen those things be upended. And new discoveries change everything about our fundamental understanding of reality. We have to not only be prepared for it, but we have to expect that the same will happen with those constants we recognize today, and that in the future, new scientific discoveries will shift those paradigms even further, and we will have to rewrite everything we thought we knew, just like a couple of hundred years ago they did. No one would have conceived at the time that Newton was really redefining science and the physical universe, that some guy would come along with a bad haircut and take it even one step further. Actually, I kind of loved Einstein's crazy mad scientist hairdo. But Einstein did just that, right? He has a dream about a cow standing too close to an electric fence and being electrocuted, and a farmer standing a distance away. And, the lapse in the observation of the electrocution, occurring based on the distance he was from the cow. Anyway, that's interesting in itself, by the way, the fact that there had been a dream that in part was the inspiration behind the revelations that Einstein would later prove with mathematical equations, and of course the groundbreaking theories of general and special relativity change yet again everything we think we know about physics.
Well, okay, and this is what I find so interesting about Einstein. As radical as 1905 was, right, when his first papers were released, special relativity, Einstein firmly believed through his math that the universe was constant and static. Right? That's it. There was no movement to the universe. Then he goes up onto Mount Wilson with Edwin Hubble. Hubble says these stars are moving. Not only are these stars moving, but entire galaxies are moving apart. Einstein goes and looks through the telescope and is looking at the photographs that Edwin Hubble is taking, and he went back and he said, I'm wrong. So he had to go back to his math and remove the static part, right? The constant, the stillness part of his equations and change it. And he admitted to that. Einstein was wrong, and it was a blunder, right? This is all new news in the world of science. And even that part of what Hubble discovered was changed again in 1998 when they found that not only was the universe expanding, but it was increasing its speed. That the speed of the universe wasn't constant on its expansion, but it was increasing, and it was increasing a lot, and that the outermost galaxies were traveling at the speed of light or faster, which again changed everything that Einstein had written. Right? And this is the part of science where it's in flux. It's always being corrected. And they're okay with that. But historians and archaeologists are not. Right? They don't
hold on. They're not what?
They don't want to go outside of the box. They want to stay in the norm. Especially look at Egyptologists. They don't even want to recognize Göbekli Tepe.
So on that point, you raised some good points, and this is something that Graham Hancock has said a number of times. He's argued that, Egyptologists, rather than being scientists, are really just kind of glorified art historians. Well, I would respectfully beg to differ. Again, the science of archaeology is indeed a lot more complex than that. And we don't have to go off on a history lesson in the development of scientific approaches to archaeology, but what I do think is important to point out is that when we talk about Egyptology, a lot of what archaeologists in the field of Egyptology are doing, and really this should be said not to vindicate Hancock so much as to make the allotment that he is partially correct but not completely. We can't just make broad statements about, well, archaeology is this or it is that. Many Egyptologists, their forte, if you will, is in the interpretation of art and pictorial representations, architecture, language, hieroglyphic, the pyramid texts, things along these lines. It's not to say that they haven't ever done any field studies or ever conducted or participated in actual excavation or anything along those lines. But again, when we look at American archaeology, when I go out, and I'm assisting, I'm not a professional archaeologist, I'm an avocationalist, which means a dedicated amateur in that field. And I've worked alongside, in my opinion, some of the very best archaeologists in America right now. But again, what we do is we go out and we do a site survey and we determine what area we want to excavate. We find an area that is going to be promising. Often there's a lot of different data that might contribute to that area that we choose to excavate. And then when the excavation occurs, there's a very methodical, very, very controlled process that occurs of, well, again, it's all blood, sweat, and tears that's involved when you're removing those layers of soil and you're going down. But I mean, the documentation, visually and otherwise, samples that are taken, if actual material remains, artifacts are discovered, their documentation and then eventual recovery, all these kinds of things. And then when you get into the realm of archaeological studies where we're taking core samples, and doing study of the sedimentary layers and all these kinds of things, there's a lot of science in that process. What Graham, I think, is talking about when he offers these critiques, and what I think is correct in what you're talking about when it relates to, a lot of old ideas are remaining and they aren't shifting is, very specialized archaeologists in the discipline of Egyptology, they approach it from a very different kind of science than maybe the American archaeologist digging a one by one, right, is going to. But nonetheless, they are trained in archaeology. I maintain is a science. I mean, whereas Graham kind of argues that, it's a very unscientific science. I know why he says that, but I do think that maybe that, there needs to be the caveat offered that many people in professional fields they've got tunnel vision. They are trained in a discipline. And that's what's really promoted in academia these days, but that doesn't mean that they aren't scientific. Now, on the other side of that really kind of bespeaks the virtue of the generalist, the person who is multidisciplinary and who can see a problem from many different angles. When Robert Schoch goes to Egypt and he's observing geological patterns that he thinks are indicative of differential weathering, and by the way, one of the things that I do, Jimmy, is having a background in voice work, I actually narrate audiobooks for some of these fantastic folks. And in 2020, that's going to be one of the books I'll be narrating, is a book co-authored by Robert Bauval and Robert Schoch about the Sphinx. And so, I know Robert Schoch pretty well. I'll tell you a story about him here in a minute, too, that is a troubling story in relation to the attitudes some academics have for his work, a story he told me at an event we were both talking at. But when Schoch shows up on the scene and he sees evidence of what he thinks is differential weathering, both on the Sphinx itself and also on the walls of the quarry surrounding it, he goes and he takes this evidence before other geologists, and they're all almost unanimous in their interpretation. They're like, well, that's exactly what that looks like. We think you're right. The Egyptological perspective wouldn't allow for that because what it seemed to suggest, what it implied, was contrary to their opinion and their worldview in relation to that opinion. If you really go back to prior to the modern era of Egyptology, most researchers who had worked on the Giza Plateau and who had worked specifically with the Sphinx thought it was older and predated many of the other monuments there in that site complex. Nowadays, it's interesting that idea does not seem to prevail, despite the fact that some evidence, maybe not all, but some evidence, including that geological data that Robert Schoch has supplied and others have advocated, seems to be in line with that, thinking that the Sphinx is indeed much older. And so we also have this sort of jurisdictional problem, this sort of turf war between different scientific disciplines where one has an idea that differs from the other, and so they can never get along and agree, and nobody can come to a consensus. But I think that we have to be open to all these possibilities. And so, yeah, again, the point is some of those criticisms are warranted. I will defend the science of archaeology because I recognize it as a scientist, or as a science, having worked with some of those scientists. But it doesn't mean it's perfect. That doesn't mean that these people aren't prone to their own errors in judgment, and that there aren't some things yet to be discerned about sites like the Sphinx. And personally, for my own part, in case anybody's wondering, I do think it's probably at very least a little older than the other sites around it. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that.
Absolutely. Let's take our break right here. We're going to go into some overtime, Micah. There's no way that you can avoid the invitation. We're going to stay right here. Our guest tonight, Micah Hanks. This is the return of Micah Hanks. And when we come back, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. You knew we were going to do just that. Our guest tonight, Micah Hanks. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. This is Fade to Black. Overtime is next. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. You can become an official Fadernaut. Just go to our membership section right there at jimmychurchradio.com. That's right. You get downloadable MP3s, autographed hats, and shirts. Become a game changer today. You can even get a private email to me. And if you're real cool, I'll give you Micah's cell phone number, too, as well. Micah, you just go to jimmychurchradio.com membership section. Sasquatch. Now, when we get into this, I'm on the fence. I don't have a better way to put it than that. And I've even seen footprints, big ones too, where I've sat back and thought to myself, I mean, really like hair-raising thoughts, like, okay, this is pretty incredible, and I didn't know how to wrap my mind around it. But I'm still on the fence. Where are you when it comes to Bigfoot and Sasquatch?
Hold on. You mean to tell me you believe all this silly stuff, but a giant anthropomorphic ape in North America still seems too out there for you, Jimmy?
Look, I have seen on the same day, I saw a daytime. This is the Grailian UFO. It's a Holy Grail alien situation. I saw the Grailian daytime UFO, 400 feet tall, shaped like a beer can, black, spinning, vertical, with witnesses all around me, like 30 people. And saw this thing in the sky, clear as day, lit up, in focus, sun shining on it, freaked out, and then it just lasted about 15 seconds and disappeared right in front of us. Now, as big as, I'm going to say, Statue of Liberty, right? Ginormous. Same day, out in the field, 4 Bigfoot prints. Somebody just posted pictures of it right now on Twitter, Micah. You can go and look. Okay. And I think that is that my foot in this picture? And this footprint is like 3 inches deep in the ground, toes, heel, and there's 4 of them, left, right, going in an arch, and they're about 6 feet apart. 6 feet, my brother. Okay? Now, and in hard-packed dirt. I'm 200 pounds. I didn't make a dent in this dirt, but these footprints are 3 inches into the ground. And hard-packed dirt. Now, on the same day, I saw both. But I'm on the fence about Bigfoot. Okay? All right?
That's good.
And that's where I'm at. I haven't seen Bigfoot. I haven't seen, I haven't seen anything. Seen the footprints. It's pretty convincing, pretty fun to look at. It's a paradigm shift when you see something like this. And I hope you're looking at these footprints. These are what we found out in this field. You can go into Twitter right now and look what everybody is posting. And it's in our documentary. And it was a fun day to see this. But
I've got to find these images. Yeah, I can't find the images in the Twitter thread. I see everybody tweeting at me there. Hello, Alana, all the way over in Hawaii. Folks all around the world, Anna and Eve and all kinds of Bob out there. So, but I'm still looking for Bigfoot footprints.
Yeah, go to hashtag F2B.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll find them.
Hashtag F2B. You'll see it right there. Can't miss it.
And here's the other thing, too, about that. Let me pull up that hashtag there. They should be
here,
somewhere.
I'll copy you on it. Here it comes. At George Norrie.
That's the guy. Folks, we are just like this.
Oh, man. There you go. You got it?
Well, let's see. He's tweeting it directly at me and still technologically challenged. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, well, obviously there's some sort of a depression. Is that a hallux? Is that an extending thumb-like toe off the side?
It is. This is a picture. When I saw this with my own 2, I mean, it's a clearly defined, sharp footprint. It's crazy. Toes, the whole shot, man. It was a bizarre thing to see. And like I said, we had 4 of these, left, right. 6 feet apart in an arch, turning to the right, and there were 4 out in the middle of this field. Crazy. Okay, so but where are you? That's the question.
Well, I'm in my own bunker, and I've allowed you for years to call yours that, but that's another matter entirely. No. As far as where I am on Sasquatch, I think I'm with you in the sense that. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not just trying to agree with you. A lot of people get frustrated because they're like, Micah, you either believe in it or you don't.
Right.
Which are you? I try honestly not to operate in that way of thinking. Again, what I argue is there is some compelling evidence, but is that enough evidence for me to say, well, I've never seen one. and there's not a decent photograph. There's that piece of footage from, the 1960s made by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin that depicts what appears to be a female Sasquatch.
And it's a great piece of footage, man. It's a great piece of footage,
but it has not reliably convinced all the skeptics. It does not. I mean, again, to me, I look at that, and there are many aspects of the Patterson-Gimlin film that compel me. I did a podcast episode about this called Frame 357. Looking deeply at this and some of the nuances of that narrative. But again, for me, the problem is that many people argue, well, that's probably just a person in a suit. Now, it looks to me like, based on the technology available in the 1960s, especially to a couple of cowboys in California at that time, that the appearance of what's in that film exceeds what they could have reliably hoaxed. And if you read the narratives about how they allegedly hoaxed it, there are a lot of problems. One theory is that, Philip Morris, a costume maker here in North Carolina who passed away a few years ago, he was based in Charlotte, just a couple of hours from me, that he made the costume. Another theory was that, and this according to the retired Pepsi Cola bottler, Bob Hieronymus, who claimed that he'd worn the suit.
Yep.
He said it was made out of horsehide, that the top portion was kind of like a tunic or a big T-shirt, that there was a waistband that drew the pant portion together. Look, quite obviously what he described was not in the film. That was a much more sophisticated costume, if it was a costume. But even Philip Morris, the costume maker, when he looked at the video, said, well, the mask isn't the same. It looks like he's made something a little different from the mask I gave him. The arms are longer. The suit I gave him didn't have breasts, so he's obviously augmented it, but I sold a suit to Patterson. Clearly that's my suit. Even Philip Morris, if you read what he said, didn't agree that what he saw in the film was the suit that he claimed he sold Patterson. Now, all that aside, the debate continues about whether that film is a physical flesh and blood organism, and no matter how good it looks, because that debate continues, I maintain that it hasn't reliably convinced the scientific community. Where I stand on it is, I look at that evidence and I say, even if it hasn't convinced the community that a creature exists, we have to consider it. And it's not the only evidence that exists. However, the body of evidence in support of the existence of Sasquatch is scant enough that it's not really enough to be able to say conclusively, yeah, this thing's out there. Now we've just got to go find it. So where I sit is, I'm one of these guys who, like you, and I think it's a fair position to be in if you're really being honest, I'm on the fence. I'm really interested in that data. I'm interested enough that I continue to pursue it. I look at the anthropological and the zoological angle. I've even looked at the archaeological angle, and we can get into a little of that if you like.
Have you found any archaeological evidence?
I'm sorry, you say, have we?
Have you? Yeah. I mean, that would certainly strongly support the position. Mm-hmm. What's the evidence that you have seen?
Well, okay, so this is really interesting. There was a monograph published, and just to be clear, I don't want to leave any, loose ends here. I'm on the fence. I'm just about like you are. I'm compelled enough by the evidence to want to continue to look. I'm not 100% convinced yet that the creature exists. That's where I am. So I'm not crazy. I don't believe in this mythical creature, but I also think it's really silly that people refer to Sasquatch as a mythical creature. Let me touch on that, and then I promise we'll talk about archaeology here. When I talk with people who say, oh, Sasquatch, that's a myth, you realize that's just mythology. It's interesting that we see UFOs going through this sort of renaissance, and most people who have not taken a whole lot of time to study the literature and who are interested in UFOs, they just kind of leap to the conclusion that, well, the most likely assessment of this phenomena is extraterrestrial visitation. And hey, we've got some instrumental data from the Navy and the Atfleer systems and the Raytheon company and the videos that the Navy released and all this stuff. So it's interesting to me that people are like, Bigfoot mythology, UFOs, alien visitors, extremely sophisticated technologies, aerospace technologies being utilized by alien visitors. Sure, I'm all in on that. And yet something like Sasquatch seems so remote. If you look at the archaeological record, if you look at human ancestors, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, if you look at, again, those outside of the Homo species, our ancient human ancestors and, or rather, I should say cousins, Homo neanderthalensis, if you go back to, for instance, Gigantopithecus, the Pleistocene era giant ape that existed in parts of Asia, which many look at and say that's about as close to an actual Sasquatch as we can get. In the anthropological record, a lot of creatures paranthropus also. These ancient anthropological wonders, I would say. You know, some of them human ancestors, some of them human cousins, some of them apes that are quite a lot unlike us, but nonetheless a lot like what is described today with Sasquatch. They exist in the fossil record. And to say that a creature that is existent in the fossil record, that something like that could not exist today, and yet on the other hand, we're so willing to leap to the conclusion that aliens are visiting Earth, and that's what UFOs are. I mean, it's kind of bizarre to me, really, where people's thinking is on that. So I just want to make that point that when people treat Sasquatch as though it's something that must be relegated to myth, they must not know a lot about anthropology and the fossil record. The other side of that, though, is, and I want to come back around to the point we were making about archaeology, because that's not really the archaeological side of this. When it comes to what do we have in terms of physical discoveries in archaeology that might support the idea of an awareness by indigenous cultures in North America of Sasquatch, there's a fascinating monograph that was published, I believe, in 1891 by James Terry, and it's entitled Sculptured Anthropoid Ape Heads from the John Day River, which the John Day River being a tributary of the Columbia River up there. But fascinating little monograph, because what it entails are a number of stone carvings that are found up there along the John Day River in Oregon that resemble ape heads. They have quite obviously simian characteristics in the faces on these stones. What's really interesting is that had been the determination of James Terry and other archaeologists, also some geologists and paleontologists who were looking at them at the time. None of these guys, if they even had any awareness of traditional indigenous legends about Sasquatch, none of them say so in that monograph. And none of them seem to interpret these as being evidence of anything like that. They were looking at these things seemingly in ignorance of any traditions or belief of Sasquatch, and looking at these going, what in the world are these carvings, and why would the indigenous cultures of Oregon have been carving ape faces? Jimmy, the conclusion they come to is, well, these are either something that they saw. For instance, there might have been a Polynesian a sailing vessel that crashed on the western coast, and one of these things was carved on one of the mastheads or something of that boat, and they saw it and they replicated it. Or, and Terry said, I opt for this option of those which we're offering. Terry said, my opinion is that this is a species that might have existed in North America a long time ago, which they knew and they carved, and it's representative of something that they had seen and known. That's what he thought they were.
Well, check this out. Let me jump in.
Sure.
Those footprints that I just showed you, right? Mm-hmm. There's more. I just sent you a second. Okay. Those were right next to the Columbia River. Trip on that. I'm listening to you. I'm like, oh, really? Okay. But I'm still on the fence. Okay. Well, let's get to the archaeological side. I don't want to run out of time. But archaeological evidence when it comes to Sasquatch, Bigfoot.
Well, no, that's what we were discussing.
That's as far as it goes. Well, okay.
Well, there is some more. There is some more. We could also cite, for instance, I'm trying to remember. Her name slips my mind, but the anthropologist who I should pull up this information while we're talking about this.
Well, what about, okay, now let's go to the extreme side, which is actually a zone where I'm a little bit more comfortable when it comes to Sasquatch. And that's the interdimensional part of this, right? That maybe it's not something physical all the time here, because that takes care of the lack of bones, right? No corpses. Okay, maybe they bury themselves out in the woods and they avoid humans, but none's ever been hit by a car. Bears get hit by cars all the time, and deer, but we don't find their bones. I understand the argument, but if you go to the interdimensional side of this, then that takes care of the lack of corpses.
Right. Now, the problem I have with that is, again, how do we prove something is interdimensional? How do we quantify that? As you mentioned earlier, you believe that applying science to the study of UFOs is what's really going to help us gain ground on that.
That's right. That's right.
Well, if we're to suppose that Sasquatch is interdimensional, we would have to have some sort of scientific grasp on what constitutes interdimensional or whether such a thing could exist first, right?
Oh, there's plenty of that. I see. That's the thing. That's the thing. When you get into quantum physics and you understand the multi-worlds theory and the multiverse and entanglement and what actually occurs in quantum physics to make those equations and the math work, then there is the possibility of something, multiple versions of something, and certainly with string theory and 10 dimensions, that there is that possibility, and the math certainly supports that. If I'm going to go into a direction where I think science is strongest, I'm going to go with interdimensional Bigfoot.
Well, hold on now. Before you do that, let me play devil's advocate. Hold on. Let me give you the spin. One of our many great conversations. I'm seeing Dan James tweeting. He's saying how much he's enjoying this. The problem is the quantum world and the things that physicists observe in the quantum relationship to reality, rather than to say the quantum world, because it's not a different world. It's just when we observe things on the quantum level, the physics that the Newtonian physics, the Einsteinian perception even, that we recognize in the physical universe begins to break down. And we begin to have these relationships to reality that are far less consistent, right? Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle called that for a reason. But I'm no scientist, I'm no physicist, so I don't want to try and break all those things down and go read a physics textbook. But the point I want to make is I do understand that the quantum level, we can't apply those aspects to the physical realm in which we all, agree that we coincide in, that we all share and we exist in. If we are to apply those principles in the furtherance of an idea that Sasquatch might be interdimensional or something along those lines, I think it's a misappropriation of those ideas. I'm all for the idea that there are other worlds. The idea of a multiverse, that seems to be something that, again, scientifically seems plausible, but we have to know more about it and the applications for that before we can say that that is a reasonable explanation for why we don't find a body of the Sasquatch. Unfortunately, here's the sad thing, and this brings us back to being on the fence. The more likely, if we're to deal in likelihoods and scientific plausibility, the more likely explanation to me is that Sasquatch simply does not exist, rather than that it does exist and it is a quantum being that somehow defies, the limitations of the quantum world and its separation from the physical reality we all occupy, and it actually seems to function in that capacity in the actual physical Newtonian physics of our waking reality. That's much more of a stretch than to say that Sasquatch simply doesn't exist. The problem I have with saying that Sasquatch simply doesn't exist is that people still say that they see the things. I know.
So
how do you reconcile that? It is a problem.
It is difficult to reconcile. For me to accept, there's two issues that I have here. I'm a walking paradox. The first, and I'm serious about this, is that I on one side, the Bigfoot, Sasquatch people out there want me to believe that Sasquatch is smart, Bigfoot is smart, they avoid humans, they communicate, they're able to hide deep in the forest, they avoid us, and therefore that's why we don't see them. And I don't buy into that today. There's too much population, there's too much video, there's too much there's too much of everything that there would be evidence of it. But on the other hand, this is where I'm a walking paradox. We have the panda. The panda avoided us for thousands of years. Yep. You just brought up mythological. Friggin' panda was a mythological creature until now.
Until it was discovered, right?
Right. So, and somebody can come up to me and go, well, what about the panda? Well, that shuts me down. So I'm now a walking paradox of myself. So I don't know which way to go. But until there is some other physical evidence of it being something physical, then I'm going to go with interdimensional. It's easier for me to believe that than Bigfoot is just out there avoiding humans. I just don't buy into that. I don't buy into that part of it. I think there's something much more mystical to it and something more paranormal to it. And that's easier for me to digest. It really is.
And, I think it's actually fine to be, you talk about being a walking paradox, but again, I think that that's okay. there's this attitude in especially the Western world that you have to, first of all, you have to believe, well, depending on who you're with and who you're talking about, you have any number of ideologies that you have to fall in step with. And here, if you're going to be part of this club, you've got to think this way. You've got to believe these things. If you don't think those things, you're outside the club. Mm-hmm. Whether that's a religion, whether that is the antithesis of religion, whether it's skepticism, whether it is a political ideology, whether it's a cultural group, any number of group thinks exist. But especially in the Western world, it seems inexcusable if you operate within more than one of them.
That's right. And you're either all in or you are not. Right? Yeah. And it's really funny. I've had my critics, Micah, and I'm sure you've enjoyed the same thing, in that if you are doing the conspiracy thing, right? UFOs, ancient Egypt, ghosts, the paranormal, time travel, then you're in with us on 9/11. You're in with us and these other crazy, you're either all in or you are not. And I'm not about that, and I never will be. I can't. I just can't. I try to be as pragmatic and objective as possible. And the other part is, being a walking paradox, is I've seen stuff. I've seen crazy things, crazy things that tell me the world is not what it seems. That's it. I'm just trying to figure it out.
That makes me all the more, I find that all the more admirable about you, that you have had experiences, but you do not feel that because of that you have to conform to a particular belief system. You maintain a certain critical mindedness, I guess, a certain skepticism, despite the fact that you've had your own experiences, because I think that that's really part of it. To be both critically minded, but also to be open-minded. People think that those things clash. I don't think that they do.
I don't either. I really don't. Hey, as we wind this down, I've got to thank you. What a fascinating, excellent conversation tonight, and I can't wait to do it again. But what are you doing now? Are you out there speaking? You working on some television? I know you just mentioned narrating some books in 2020. What's going on?
Yeah, there's some narration going on. Of course, I'm working on this historical UFO project, which I hope will be published, if not sometime this year, because it's going to be a tremendous undertaking, but one that I feel is extremely timely and something that I hope, in the furtherance of all the stuff we've discussed tonight, including scientific and historical knowledge, I think it will be of merit. So I'm working on that. The 7 Ages guys and I are always at work. We have podcasts, which are available at 7ages.org. And, of course, I've got the Micah Hanks program and the Middle Theory podcasts. All my podcasts can be found at micahhanks.com. And, yeah, there have been some inquiries from some television networks about actually one possible Sasquatch-related program that would look at this from a historical perspective, which I'm more than happy to provide some commentary on when and where available. And then, of course, as always, there'll probably be some events. I don't have anything on my calendar right now. I'll probably have some by April confirmed, and there'll be a lot of travel and research stuff going on. So, Jimmy, I hope somewhere out there I'll meet you along the way. How's that?
You are the very best, Micah. Thank you so much, and be safe and enjoy 2020. It's going to be an incredible year, my friend. Thank you so much.
Likewise, brother. My pleasure.
Micah Hanks. Again, the links for MicahHanks.com are right there, JimmyChurchRadio.com. Also, Micah's blog is there. You need to go and check that out. The Middle Theories podcast, and, of course, the Micah Hanks program. And I want to thank Micah for coming on tonight and also doing some overtime. And George, enjoy that impersonation. It still makes me laugh. Tomorrow night, right here, William Henry. We're going to go into ancient secrets and discuss all of his latest research and, of course, his travels over to Egypt and France. We'll be discussing all of that tomorrow night. With that, I am going to get out of here. We went pole to pole. So let's just say Fade to Black's executive producer is Rita Kamurian. Show was produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitoa, and Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy, SpaceboyMusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast owned and copyrighted 2020 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. You can follow Micah at Micah Hanks right there on Twitter. Until tomorrow night with William Henry, I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Be safe. Go Beckley Tepe.